Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us in our second meeting today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I can talk about the agenda for the day. Sorry, after 3 years of using Zoom consistently, I still continue to have the screens disappear on me. Okay. So our agenda for today is first I wanted to welcome and give a little overview of what our day is and what we're looking to accomplish. I wanted to then I'm going to go over the sector baseline and the preliminary goal recommendations with a focus on just making sure that everybody has an opportunity to understand what the preliminary potential goals are for each of the sectors. So if you're not in a sector, you can kind of follow along as we go through this process and talk a little bit about the intent of what we've provided you. And then the second half, or actually 2/3 or so of the meeting, is really going to be focused on sub-teams. And so I'm going to share a little bit about kind of what prepping us for those sub-team discussions. And then we're going to go through 2 rounds of some sub-team breakouts. And which is why we had everybody sign up for 2 groups. If you have not signed up for your groups yet, not a problem. You can choose today as we go into breakout, and then you need to let me know so we can make sure we get you on the spreadsheet. Because I try to keep track of who's in what group, because at a meeting somebody may forget which group they're in. So I want to be able to make sure we can help people get into the right discussions. So if you choose a group today, just either make sure you sign up on the spreadsheet or let me know so that I can make sure I can get that written down. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. So that's our meeting. So we had our first meeting, which was the introduction to sort of positioning, what are we doing here and how are we going to go about this process. Today we find ourselves at meeting 2, and that is where we're going to begin our conversations about goals. What do we think we want to accomplish? Sector by sector, what do we think is important in those sectors, and what kind of end vision do we think we have for that sector? And then following getting a sense of our goals, and we can still think about them as preliminary. It's not done until it's done, so to speak. But we want to establish for ourselves what we think we want to accomplish, so that then through the following workshops, we can collaborate on exploring ideas about how to achieve those goals for each sector. And I will say so that this meeting today is still, I'm going to have a presentation in the front here as we move forward through those 4 heavy workshop sessions. And I think of them as heavy workshops just because it's exactly that. We are focused very heavily on making sure it's collaborative time. So those next 4 meetings, there will be a little bit of presentation, but it's mostly about what are we trying to do today, and that kind of a thing. So the next 4 meetings are going to be almost entirely breakout and opportunities for you all to talk with each other and explore ideas. I will also say that these are designed with a little bit of overlap opportunity. So in other words, our goal for today is to see if we can establish a consensus on the goals for each sub-team. If a sub-team can do that, awesome, lovely. If the conversation is robust and we don't feel like we've quite finished that conversation, that's okay. In our next meeting, teams can either continue the conversation on goals to finish it up and then start talking about actions, or they can just dive right into talking about actions. So just to give you a sense that we try to build a little bit of flexibility, and so no panic if we don't achieve the
No problem.
Actually, I'm going to ask you if everybody can mute themselves, that would be great. And then, of course, if you want to ask a question, you can open it up.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. Well, I got on it late, but I don't have that drawing must be on the server. It's got to be because
Lori, please mute yourself.
Lori, so, yeah.
So because 3 years hit the grass.
Lori, please mute yourself.
Post-COVID, everything.
I'm trying to find
when this started,
my screen is limited, so I'm trying to find where that is.
The Excel stuff was really.
If you go into participants.
Up there, okay.
Oh, okay.
But then it transitioned into.
Okay, there. Alrighty, I think I got it. Sorry, that's one of my pet peeves on Zoom. I wish there was an easy way for me to see. I can't. Once I do into presentation mode, I can't see anything.
Ted, would you like to make me a co-host, Ted?
Yeah, let me pause to do that too. That's a lovely idea.
I think that I can mute people, correct?
Yeah, I believe so. Awesome. All right,
once you're a co-host, you can mute people.
Okay. All right.
It's from the participants window. You can do that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. So just trying to position today. Today, we really want to get into goals. If we finish that conversation today, lovely. If it doesn't finish for any sub-team, don't worry. We'll be able to pick up where we left off at our next discussion. So that's really what I want to get, kind of positioning it. To kind of give you a sense of how this evolves then over time is in that meeting 3, we're going to start focusing in on actions, exploring actions. And then we'll have a couple opportunities. The next couple of workshops will be about continuing to explore actions and then refining actions. And then as we move into that meeting 6, we're going to start thinking about potential implementation partners, advocates, resources that we might have in our community that can help implement, or at least could be a resource potentially. So that's kind of where we're going in the next few workshops. So goals today, actions tomorrow. Okay, so just touching on the baseline documents. Again, the team does not have to read through all of these documents. They are available if you want to go through them. If any of them support your interests or you want to do that, that's awesome. We've made them available. You do not have to read through them all. So we did the vulnerability assessment, greenhouse gas inventory, ground cover study, and renewable energy potential study. Those then have been summarized in the baseline assessment document. And the intent for this document, all of these documents are, as we call them, they're process documents. So in other words, it's our approach at just trying to see what can we see about the county and the communities in the county. What kind of information can we pull together? What can that help inform as far as what we may want to do as a goal? And can give us some sense of prioritization. What kind of content can we pull from that can just help the team move through this process and then help us support in creating a final plan when we do get to that point. So think of them as preliminary. They're there to give us some basis of conversation and something to work from. The other thing that I'll point out is the goal recommendations are only us putting something out there for purposes of debate and discussion to support the discussion. So we're not trying to tell you that you have to do these goals. We're just trying to give you, instead of having to start with a blank piece of paper, give you a place to start that you can then decide how do we react to this? How do we think about this? What other ideas do we have? What do we not like? What do we like? So it's all intended to help provide a place for the collaboration to begin. So to just kind of give you a sense of what's in these documents, I'm not going to go into them in any great depth, but just a sense, if anything piques your interest, you can look into it further. All of these resources are on the team page. The vulnerability assessment, just kind of starting off, I love these graphics. This is called climate stripes. You may have seen this before. This is every year's average temperature compared to each other for the state of Illinois since 1895. If it's a red year, it means it's warmer or hotter than usual, or average, I should say. If it's a blue year, it's cooler than average. And I will say that averages, when we talk about climate, it's actually a 30-year window. So if it's a red year over here, we can see that it is tending to lean towards red, towards the right. If it's a red year over here, it is even redder when compared to blue years over on the left side of the screen, because these are all compared within 30-year averages. We can anticipate the climate change that we have been experiencing. We can anticipate that to continue by the middle of this century, which is now just less than 2 decades away. That time frame in the middle, we can anticipate an increase in temperatures of up to 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. We can expect 12 to 17 days more a year with a high temperature of 95 or hotter than what we currently experience. These all relate also to an increase in air conditioning demand as we increase our average temperature. That, of course, will also relate to increased electricity need and infrastructure need. We can expect probably an increase of as much as 15% higher annual rainfall. But very importantly, our rainfall, the trends are that we're pulling our rainfall apart. We're having rainfall, longer periods of time between rainfall, which means that when it does rain, it tends to rain heavier. And we can expect an increase of 30% more heavy precipitation events. So that's events that drop, 1.5 to 2 inches of rain kind of a thing or more. By the way, because they're spreading apart our rain events, that means that our drought potential is going to increase. And that's a double whammy. Drier ground absorbs water less well. Heavier rains falling on it means more runoff, more flash flood potential. By the middle of the century, we can also expect about 20 days more in our growing season, which is great for my tomatoes, not so great for mosquitoes, allergies, asthma, etc. If we do not reduce our greenhouse gas emissions globally, as well as here within the region, we can anticipate most of these numbers will double or more by the end of the century, and the trends that they represent will all continue. So that means that by the end of the century, we could be experiencing an increase of at least 9 degrees Fahrenheit average temperature increase. By the end of the century, that means that summers in Kane County could feel similar to Montgomery, Alabama. That's similar to picking up the county and moving it south about 10 miles every year, or about 145 feet every day between now and the end of the century. So if we're all successful in reducing our emissions, it won't be, our impact we may stop about halfway down there. So our actions to reduce emissions are really beneficial and very key for avoiding and reducing what we have to adopt to for the second half of our century. The primary climate risks that our climate change projections indicate or illustrate are impacts like extreme weather and temperature, flooding, air quality impacts. And this year in particular, I think we all are recognizing that air quality impact is actually a thing that Midwesterners should be concerned about. Most Midwesterners don't think of air quality as something that we need to worry about, but we think of it as something that LA has to worry about. But I think this year's started to point out that air quality and climate change really are interwoven and something that will impact us. Vector-borne diseases, as we think about that, 1 week of increased growing season is one full life cycle for mosquitoes and all the vector-borne illnesses that represents. Food insecurity concerns, water quality and waterborne disease potential, and infrastructure or power failure. The economic impacts that relate to these or related impacts are things like crop yield and impacts that the changing weather projections and climate, things like droughts and floods can have on crop yield, mortality, energy cost volatility, and property and violent crime also is linked to some of these projections. Just looking at a couple of these sorts of impacts, taking flooding, for instance, in the study, we have a high-level overview provided by First Street Foundation of flood risk that different communities in the county might look at. They study specific building locations. Overall, as a county, we have, on average, sort of moderate risk for flooding. However, of course, within that moderate, we have areas that are significant risk, right? As well as some areas where flooding might be more minimal. But we have an indication of roughly how many structures are at least some risk of flooding in the coming decades. We also did a high-level overview of some of the critical facilities in the community, just flagging those which may be at risk for flooding. We did not do, this is a high-level overview, so we did not do a detailed site assessment for each of the buildings, but instead looked at critical facilities across the entire county to try to flag those that are potentially in an area that may cause some concern. In terms of crop yield, Illinois is already experiencing a climate that is significantly warmer and wetter than at any time in the last 120 years. Those impacts, like wetter winters and springs, hotter, drier summers, and longer stretches of dry spells, as I've been talking about, between rain events that are more intense and more likely to cause runoff. All of those have impacts that are likely to have some impact on agriculture, and of course, impact on agriculture, not just in Illinois, but globally, these impacts can exist. That can also increase risk of flood damage to crops and food security potential concerns. By 2055, it's projected that yields of rain-fed corn in central Illinois may decline by as much as 34% annually. Of course, these climate risks also impact us as people. And of course, we all live on this globe together. We all share this world. We all have vulnerabilities because we are all human. When we talk about climate adaptation planning, the best practice is to make sure that we're thinking of those that are potentially most vulnerable amongst us. The reason for that is that if we can help address the vulnerabilities of those that may be more vulnerable than the average, so to speak, if we can help address those vulnerabilities, we are helping all of us become less vulnerable. So that's why adaptation planning has a tendency of focusing on those that are most vulnerable as we think about solutions. We've mapped all of the vulnerable populations throughout the county, at least demographically speaking. And in the study, we've identified those risks that group may be more susceptible or at risk to. The groupings of people, the demographics of people that are commonly identified as potentially more vulnerable to climate change impacts are listed in front of you here. It's children, older adults, those with disabilities, people of color, at-risk workers, think first responders, folks, farmers, folks that work out in the elements regularly or day after day, etc. Through the assessment that we did, we have a summary of those risks that we are probably more vulnerable to, and the demographics of our community that kind of stand out as larger groups of people that may have higher vulnerabilities to those. Now, that is not to say that, of course, we don't want to ignore some vulnerability that isn't highlighted, and nor do we want to ignore some group of person that isn't highlighted. We're just saying that if push comes to shove and we have to prioritize focus areas, the focus on the primary risks highlighted here are probably the ones that we could get the most bang for our buck and thinking about. And the populations highlighted, the older adults, those in economic stress, and people of color are the demographic groupings that are the larger share of the vulnerable populations. So again, if we need to prioritize, it gives us a sense of how we may want to think about that. Not that we're ignoring anybody, though. The GHG inventory and forecast, we put that together. We pulled from data from CMAP as well as generated data specific to this effort, specifically around agriculture and other sections that were not included in CMAP. The good news is that from 2010 through 2019, we've seen a decrease in our emissions by about 5%. That's fantastic. The 2019 total is over 7 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. We tend to do at least one visual related to greenhouse gas emissions, because who knows what 7 million metric tons of greenhouse gas is like. It's something we don't see in our life. We literally cannot interact with it. It's difficult to perceive. So this volume is equal to 2019's countywide emissions. We're seeing it from about 2.5 miles away. It's a cube that's about a mile on each side. So it contains 137.5 billion cubic feet of human-made greenhouse gas emissions that we're adding to the atmosphere every year. So these are active greenhouse gas molecules that do not currently exist in the atmosphere that we're putting into the atmosphere every year, just to kind of give you a sense of order of magnitude. And this little chart here gives you a breakdown of the various sectors. Agriculture makes up a little less than 2.5%. Solid waste, a little over 3%, transportation, about 32%, natural gas or heating fuels, about 28%, and electricity, about 34%. So it tells us, certainly there's opportunity in all those sectors. And so we want to explore those opportunities. And of course, it tells us that our biggest focal areas for reductions, our big hitters, are going to be transportation and our building and energy sectors. This little chart gives us a breakdown on per capita, how those different emissions relate to each of us per capita. For instance, the average person in Kane County is responsible for about 4.5 metric tons of electric emissions a year. There's not a lot to do with that, except for we can use per capita emissions to draw comparisons with other communities and just kind of get a sense of what does that mean? How are we doing? Where can we learn? Who's ahead of us, and how can we do something about that? CMAP did this wonderful little chart here that shows the heavy blue bars are the total emissions by county. You can see that Kane is, in the lower portion, about the third lowest or so, but these blue dots are per capita, and the per capita is about the third or fourth highest. So it just illustrates that in terms of overall aggregate emissions, Kane County is smaller than a number of the other metro counties, but on a per capita basis, we're swinging at a higher weight. Which the good news is that means that there's things that we can do. We can do things about that. We can learn from that and focus on how we might make change. Just looking at it on a sector by sector basis, just kind of what the trends are for each of those sectors and the change that has occurred over time. And basically, we've seen solid waste and electricity trend downwards. So they get a little green check, meaning that so far they seem to be heading in the right directions. Maybe not at the pace that we want them to or need them to be, but they're heading in the right directions. Agriculture, transportation, and natural gas or heating fuel, it tends to right now be heading perhaps in the direction we'd like to correct. We also did a projection through 2050 of what emissions might be for the county. And so these projections are based on what we can see. CMAP's projections for population counts. They have projections for traffic counts. Those are all included. So projections like that planning departments are using for planning for the future are baked into this, as well as things like we know that there's going to be a certain kind of adaptation of electric vehicles in the next decade or two. And so that's kind of reflected in there. We know that vehicles increase in their fuel efficiency every year. Those kinds of projections are baked in here also. And so the upshot is that we have some positive trends. We can expect that our emissions per mile driven, for instance, are going to continue to decrease. We can expect that our electric emissions per kilowatt hour consumed are going to continue to decrease. However, you'll see that the chart overall is not really moving much. And that is due entirely to the current projections for population. So Kane County has some pretty significant population projections in the coming decades. And should those come to pass, with the projected trends for raw consumption and energy emissions per consumption. We can anticipate that if we don't intervene, our emissions might stay relatively flatline, where we have improvements in per kilowatt, for instance, but we have more people, so we're consuming more kilowatts, right? So this is nothing to feel bad about. It just gives us a good sense that, hey, we've got some things that we want to work on, we need to work on, and that also means there's opportunity in here as well. Ground cover studies. So we looked at just at a high level census tract by census tract basis, what the tree canopy coverage is, lawn and natural prairie grass coverage, open water, agricultural land. We also looked at impervious surfaces that are roads, that are buildings, that are dark, that are light. So we're just trying to get a good sense of what our physical ground cover is, because all of those relate to different aspects of adaptation or opportunity. Trees sequester carbon, trees help cool space, native plants have deep root systems and support biodiversity and can help us manage water in a way that's different from manicured lawns, for instance. So just getting a good sense of our land cover characteristics, we can start to identify where might opportunities be. And so countywide, and of course, this information, we can also break it down city by city in the future because it's all available by census tracts. It's been aggregated right now as a countywide. But countywide, we've got about 17% trees, about 26.5% that are grass covered, which could be lawn or prairie. We've got about 41% that is agriculture cover, about 2% that is water, about 4%, which is impervious surfaces, so hard surfaces that are light. So think concrete or white roofs. And we've got about 10% that is dark impervious surface. So think asphalt or, tar roof kind of spaces. When we look at the grasses area, the breakdown of what is green and growy, 60% of that is, or 61% of that is agriculture. About 24% of that is manicured lawns, things that we're mowing, and about 15% is prairie, whether it's naturally occurring or restored prairie. So this just gives us a sense that, hey, there might be some opportunities in here. Is all the lawn that's being manicured, is all of that needed? Could some of it be some other green growy function, whether it's trees or prairie grass or something like that, right? Within our impervious surfaces, we've got about 50% of it, which is dark pavement. So think roads, parking lots, very prominently. About 20% is light pavement, so think concrete, roads or parking. About 20% of it is dark buildings, so again, think asphalt roofs, or about 10% of it is light buildings, so again, think white roof. And so in here, there's some lessons or opportunities relative to stormwater runoff. Our impervious surfaces, can some of that become pervious? Are there parking opportunities that could become pervious pavers? Do we need some parking? Can some of that parking convert to prairie grass or agricultural use that becomes permeable? Also, heat island impacts, where we have dark surfaces, there is a direct relationship to heat island, micro heat island and macro heat island. Just think about on a 95-degree day, walking across an asphalt parking lot, a big asphalt parking lot. What does that feel like versus walking across a grass field or a forest, right? All of those have different physical experiences that accumulates for the spaces around it also and impacts the experience of the lived experience. So these dark surfaces offer opportunities for us. Whether we lighten them or simply swap them out from a hard surface to something that's soft. The other thing that we do once we get it on a census tract by census tract basis, we can compare those ground cover characteristics to our populations. And so we've ordered all of the census tracts in the county from those which are that have the highest low income shares at the top. So we could say the poorest census tracts, if to use that word, but those that have the highest concentrations of low-income folks, to those census tracts that have the lowest concentration of low-income folks. And the trend that we're seeing here is that, and this is very common, we're seeing that impervious surfaces decrease as low-income community share decreases. So in other words, the more low-income community members we have in a census tract, by and large, the more impervious surfaces that we have, and typically the more dark impervious. So that means those heat island impacts that I talked about are starting to be more and more experienced by those amongst us that are potentially more vulnerable. And that is not something to feel shame about. That happens in every single community that we work with. It's a pretty consistent thing. The good news is it also illustrates how we might be able to focus. If we focused, if we had an opportunity to replace some impervious surfaces with things like prairie grass or reduce some dark impervious surfaces, where might we have the greatest bang for the buck? Well, in the areas that have the biggest impacts. So it can help us prioritize a little bit. The other thing that we typically look at is the trend line for tree canopy cover. And interestingly enough, when we look at it countywide, there is no trend that we can discern. But you can see that it zigzags back and forth. I think if we start looking at this on the municipal boundary basis, which will then take these and reshuffle the order of them, of course, when we start grouping our census tracts together by municipality, I suspect that we would start seeing a trend line that is similar for tree canopy cover, but on a countywide basis, the trend line does not exist. So the whole point of this study is to, again, help us identify, where might we be able to have impacts by thinking about what we do with our ground and trees and such. And also then we've mapped out an illustration of what a potential goal might be and what might that take to achieve that goal. And so we've projected out, just as a starter, an increase by 2040 of 2.5% land cover converting to trees. So that's not a 2.5% increase over our current canopy. It's a 2.5% increase of all the land becoming tree canopy cover. So it's actually a pretty significant goal. For this purposes of this illustration, it's prioritized through three sort of rankings. Those portions of the county that could use that tree canopy cover the most, we were saying, well, what if we targeted a 20% increase for those? And those that, everybody can benefit from good trees, but those that need, that are in greatest need for them the least, I'll say, we said an increase of 3%. And those are over existing canopy. So taking the existing canopy and increasing it by 20%, taking the existing canopy, increasing it by 3%. Doing all of that, we would capture another 2.5% of absolute land value by 2040. And again, we're not telling you that you have to have this as a goal. What we're trying to do is just give you some tools so that you know that if you establish a tree canopy relationship, you say, hey, we want to increase the tree canopy by 1% or 100% or whatever goal you want to have for these things. We can relate it back to our initial study, and we can have a sense as to what the order of magnitude is, because we've mapped out, in order to hit the preliminary goal that we've shown, we know roughly how many new trees we would have to plant each year in order to achieve that goal. And again, so this can be tweaked to any goal, and we can just simply reverse engineer the math to say, okay, that means roughly X number of trees. The last baseline is just the renewable energy potential study. We used satellite data and other data sets to project out potential, how many solar viable buildings there are in the community. We did it on a zip code basis, because that's where the data sets are available. So how many buildings are available for solar in the community potentially? And we related that to how much rooftop solar potential there is. And then we also looked at carport which is putting solar over parking, and also ground mounted, which of course putting solar on lawn spaces. And for those, we just for the building mounted, we based it on what is actually physically possible, and then an absorption rate saying that, well, just because I can put solar on my building doesn't mean I'm likely to do it necessarily. How many folks can we anticipate might participate, especially considering we have a change in what's available from a funding perspective, which I think will motivate it. And then for the ground mounted in the parking lot, we just established, well, what if we said, 0.5% or 0.25% of the parking could be used for solar? What would that get us? And so we also looked at a renewable energy strategy, which is called plasma gasification. This is a waste to energy strategy, but it is not incineration. So incineration, waste to energy, we take stuff, we burn it. As it burns, it's creating heat and it turns turbines and creates electricity. Plasma gasification is, now I'm an architect, I'm not a scientist, so sometimes I explain things a little bit simplistically. Forgive me for that. But basically, plasma gasification is you take a tube that has no interaction with the atmosphere. It's an enclosed tube. We seal it off. We superheat it. We get it to like 5,000 degrees kind of a temperature range. I mean, it's very hot. And what happens is essentially a phase change. The stuff that's in there basically melts and changes its phase. It then creates chemical chain reactions. The end result of plasma gasification are basically two products. The first product is what is called a synth gas, which is basically human-made natural gas. The second product depends a little bit on what you put in it. If you put organics in it, the second product is what is called biochar, which is a soil amendment. It's an organic material that actually increases the carbon sequestration of soil and can help provide more carbon content to make the soil even more productive. So biochar is the byproduct physically if you put organics in it. If you put inorganics in it, the second product is basically a human-made rock. It's a hard inert material that's just solid. But the point with this is that the synth gas is what from a climate perspective is a carbon-free material because it's carbon that has already been captured out of the atmosphere. If we burn it, we're just using the atmospheric cycle. So from an accounting standpoint, it does not increase our emissions. That synth gas, that energy can be, we can create electricity out of it, or we could create hydrogen fuel, or we could create renewable diesel, or we could create ammonia. And ammonia can be used either as a fluid that we burn. You can run generator sets off of ammonia if you want. Or you can take ammonia and turn it into fertilizer. So the really interesting potential here for a county that has both diesel fuel consumption needs, maybe we're going to have some hydrogen fuel vehicles in the coming years. And we clearly have farm functions that use fertilizers. We can take this as a potential waste to energy that creates a byproduct that we can use for fertilizers or for some of these hard to change fuels like diesel as a transitionary strategy. So we just mapped that out there so that it's out there as a potential, and you get a sense of the order of magnitude of potential for the county. So all of this then has gone into the baseline goal document. We try to summarize our findings for each section, and you'll see at the beginning we have a starter potential goal and reduction by sector. The important thing here is to say this is a starter. This does not need to be the goal that the team ends up with. It can be something different. But what we want to make sure you understand is that the decisions that we may make will affect these numbers. So we've put forth a potential goal for everything, and then we've modeled based on that potential goal. So as the team talks about, say, buildings and energy, if you decide, hey, we kind of like this goal, but we think it's half of what it should be. We think it should be doubled. Well, that would increase these numbers. It would change this chart. if we decide it should be half. I think that's too aggressive. That's not right for us. We think it needs to be half what is in there. That's okay. It will also change this chart, right? So I just want you to understand that we've mapped out a potential vision and that they just relate to each other, that you can establish goals as you believe appropriate for the community. What those goals are will then interact with this chart and move it forward or back. I shouldn't say forward, increase or decrease changes to the chart accordingly. So that's really the key, is that we've mapped out something and we can do the math forwards and backwards to see how that lands us. Each section then, hopefully you've seen the section for your sub teams. If you have not, each section's got a little bit of summary of some of our findings and some content just to sort of be aware of. And then has a summary of some of the adaptation considerations just to be mindful of for that section, and these preliminary starter goals. And as I say, these starter goals are just a place to start. You'll see also that we've related each of those starter goal statements with the corresponding objectives in the Mayor's Caucus Climate Action Plan. So we're relating to that plan, and you can see which ones each of those relate to. Sometimes it relates to more than one objective. So again, it's just a place to start. You can decide that you like these goals. You can decide that you like them, but they should be different. You can decide that something's missing, etc. We're just trying to give you a place to go. To give everybody a sense, well, actually, and what I wanted to point out too is that the way the plans are put together is first we're establishing strategic goals, which are the things that we'll talk about today. So they're directional statements. They're sort of visionary, if you will. And a good strategy tries to give us an end, a clear enough end picture of what we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it's hard, but wherever we can give quantifiable numbers or a way to quantify it, we want to try to do that. So an example is reduce community-wide energy consumption by 10%. It's a very clear goal. It gives us a number that we can shoot at, and it gives a good sense of what we want the end picture to be by the end of this plan implementation. You'll see, though, that if you ask yourself, okay, all right, I understand what we want to accomplish, but I don't know how we're going to do it. How we are to do it are the actions that we'll be creating together. And so those are detailed items that we can enlist, we can move forward with in order to achieve those goals. So one example is establish a large business energy efficiency program to promote building improvements and practices, reducing energy use, target 10 large businesses commissioned annually. So you can see that would be just one step, but a specific thing that we can do in order to bring about that end state that we're trying to achieve. So today we're looking at strategies, the goal statements. And again, if we don't finish that conversation, that's okay. We'll finish it up at our next meeting. The workshops in the future, then we'll be exploring, well, okay, great. So now we know what we want to accomplish. Let's explore ideas on how to get there. So just giving you a sense, I'm not going to read through each one of the strategic goals for each sector, but I just want everybody to have a sense of what's in there, so to speak. Within transportation, so you'll see that this is put together frequently. We think about pathways like reducing consumption, etc. Fuel switching, so switching to things that have less emissions. So as we consume things, we have less impact. There's also adaptation, which doesn't necessarily show up in this sector, but things that are adaptive focus. So we try to kind of call out each of those as appropriate. But within transportation, we're looking to reduce. So let's reduce how much miles we're driving. Let's increase public transit usership, which relates to reducing VNT miles. Let's increase the density of our populated areas. So in other words, as the county grows, let's try to encourage and manage that growth so that we're using as much as possible land that that is already developed. That will have multiple benefits. One, it will just simply retain more and more open space for agriculture and other open space benefits and biodiversity. But very importantly, there are great studies that illustrate that for every percentage of density, there is a direct relationship to walkability, bikeability, effectiveness of public transit, et cetera. So the more we think about our development in terms of appropriate density, the more we're supporting opportunities to have good transportation strategies. Fuel switching is looking at things like increasing electric vehicles, also establishing some viable renewable fuels, because we recognize that not everything's going to be electrified by Tuesday. We're probably going to be consuming diesel for a while for some certain equipment that just is not going to be electrified, maybe at the pace we want it to be. So how can we establish renewable fuels as a transitionary strategy? And then basically taking those similar actions and now applying them to municipal operations. So how can government entities, cities and county, apply these to government operations? And then you'll see the breakdown of emissions reductions that these relate to. For buildings and energy, we're looking again at reductions. So that's increase energy efficiency. That's reduce how much energy we consume. Relative to that, that's increase the adoption of high performance buildings. So there are buildings that are known as net zeros, which net zero means that it produces as much electricity or energy on site that it consumes in a year. In order to do that, usually it's a highly efficient building. So just increasing those practices can go a long way. Looking to fuel switch. So let's get more buildings using things like solar thermal or electric thermal rather than burning fossil fuels on site for heating. Let's increase the amount of green source renewables. So either it's on-site renewables or renewables that we're purchasing through a third party like our utility. So increasing renewable electricity. Adaptation, increasing the resilience of our community buildings, making sure that we're thinking about those, particularly buildings that are key, important structures that we need to make sure are running or have vulnerable populations in them, say nursing homes. But across the board, how can we increase resilience? And then again, similar strategies that we're then applying to our government operations. How can the county government and municipal governments focus on doing those for their buildings as well? Within waste, we're looking at reducing our total solid waste. A pound of trash saved is a pound of trash earned, so to speak. Everything that it's the old reduce, reuse, recycle. Number one, let's reduce. Let's produce less trash to begin with. Secondly, let's increase our diversion, particularly among organics. The more we can divert organics away from landfill, and we can create beneficial use. Compost becomes soil. The plasma gasification strategy, for instance, that I've mapped out. The benefit of using organics, we can create biochar, which increases soil health and carbon sequestration. Thirdly, we want to increase diversion for recycling. How can we increase the share of recyclable materials that actually get recycled instead of being thrown in the trash? Decrease municipal solid waste from government operations. So again, applying these same strategies that are community-wide, doing it at the government operation level. Within our our food and agriculture, we have sequestration as an opportunity, increasing the adoption of carbon positive soil, crop and fertilizing, irrigation and drainage management practices. That's a little wordy maybe, but increasing the climate positive farming practices, I guess we could say. Increasing the share of farms using high feed efficiency practices for those that have animals, particularly cows. We've put in the study sort of from the high to lower impact of animals, so you can get a sense of prioritization there. Reducing GHG emissions from manure management. So what can we do to, rather than have manure create greenhouse gas emissions that just get emitted, what can we do to either capture those, reduce those, turn that into energy, et cetera? Fuel switching, shifting to low or no GHG or renewable energy in our agricultural operations throughout the county. And then adaptation, looking to increase production of and access to local food, particularly those that can serve low income or food insecure individuals. So folks that maybe don't have enough access to quality fruits and vegetables, quality food, or food in general. What can we do to help increase their access to that and decrease food insecurity? Reducing food hunger and food waste, and protecting and preserving our agricultural land while increasing its resilience to climate shocks. So those impacts in the future, flooding and so forth. What can we do to help protect farms, both keeping farmland protected and active, but also making it stronger for the future? In our water and wastewater, looking at reducing our water, or increasing, I should say, our water conservation. So let's reduce how much water we consume. And of course, the wastewater that relates to. As we increase our conservation, our wastewater generation goes down, if not equally, at least in parallel fashion. For adaptation, looking to update the design standards and plans to meet projected climate change impacts of water and flood mitigation. Increasing groundwater, stream, river, and wetland quality. And looking to educate, engage, and empower the public on water quality and conservation issues. Within our green space and ecosystems, we've put out a goal of increasing tree canopy cover, particularly with a priority in neighborhoods, in priority neighborhoods, I should say, and so in areas that might have high vulnerable populations. Increasing our county-wide coverage from 16.9 to 18%, and that's absolute ground cover. So that's not a 2% increase of, or the 1.1% increase by 2030. It's 1.1% of total land value, and 19.5% by 2040. So a 2.5% increase by 2040. Looking to increase the pollinator supportiveness of our lawns and grasslands. So, we can do that through turf replacement. Let's swap out things that we mow with things like prairie restoration, native grasses, wildflowers, etc. Looking to reduce heat island effects through swapping out dark impervious surfaces, particularly in those neighborhoods that are more impacted by dark impervious surfaces and micro heat island effects. So we can do that through just simply reducing impervious surfaces, or we can put green roofs on buildings, or use pervious pavement surfaces for parking, those sorts of things. Looking to reduce invasive species and increase climate resilience and biodiversity of our tree canopy, parks, and green spaces. And looking to increase the connectivity, accessibility, and equity of our parks and green spaces. And so by connectivity and accessibility, we can think of that both in terms of people, having it connect so that people can use these spaces and it's accessible to humans, and accessible from a disability perspective. So all things accessible. And also we can think of it in terms of connecting for wildlife and biodiversity, pollinators. How do we create connections between our wonderful green spaces in a way that can benefit pollinators, for instance, or deer that are moving through our community? How can we guide that in a way that causes less problems for hitting them, right? And better health for the deer themselves, as an example. So that's what we mean by connectivity, both human and other. Health and safety, so looking to assist the county's vulnerable populations in preparing for and mitigating climate change impacts. Educating and engaging the public on health and safety risks, ensuring that the mission critical emergency services and healthcare facilities within the county are prepared for the impacts of climate change, and strengthening the community response capacity and social support networks. So much comes with health and safety with connections between people. Recognizing that your elderly neighbor, maybe we should check in on them when it's 90 degrees, those kinds of things, and social networks that can help provide services and connect people with things that they need. So what can we do to make sure that those networks are in place and strengthened and prepared for changes? And then finally, in the climate economy section, looking to capture the economic value of climate action. Hey, there's money to be had here. Instead of shipping, exporting our funds to North Dakota or Canada for heating fuel or gas, the more we can generate locally through renewables means jobs local, means economic development local. It also, there's opportunities to literally get money. If I invest in solar on my house, I've had to put some money into it, but I'm going to capture a return on investment with that. How can we make that capture more of that for our community? Grants and so forth. If there's free money out there, let's get it for our communities. What can we do to capture these things? Supporting equitable workforce development. Some of these changes mean jobs. Somebody will be building more solar panels. I can guarantee it. Somebody's going to be building more electric vehicles, et cetera. What can we do to capture some of these potentials for our people and to create workforce in our communities? Supporting local business operations and building resilience. Is everybody thinking through how their supply chain might be impacted? COVID, I think, has woken us up to the idea that we are internationally interconnected. Impacts can affect supply chains. Climate change also can affect us. How are our businesses prepared to deal with that? What resilience do they need for their operations? And then finally, establishing a sustainable financing for the implementation phase of the climate action plan. So just looking at how can we secure funds and financing for that. So as I've said, all of those are starter points. When we talk about the goals, when the team can talk about the goals, you can decide these ideas are just there for discussion. So it's a starter. But as I've pointed out, that those that have greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with them, we have modeled them based on these starter points. So the goals that we've put before you would result in a 26 and a half, 20, yeah, 3.5, 26 and a half. Sorry, I'm trying to do math. I'm not quick this morning. But a 26.5% reduction by 2030. So that means that we would reduce, we would have about 73% of our current emissions remaining, but about 26% would no longer be there just in the next 7-8 years. So using that as a starter point, the starter potential overall goal that we've put out there is to say to reduce countywide greenhouse gas emissions by 25% below 2019 levels by 2030, and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Now, I will say that this goal meets the IPCC recommendations. So the International Panel on Climate Change, the UN panel that helps map out recommendations in science around climate change for policymakers. They have recommended goals. This fits it. Now, it kind of just barely fits it. The 25% below 2019 levels by 2030 is exactly where it would need to be in order to help keep emissions at 2 degrees or less. In order to align with 1.5 degrees or less, that number would want to go up closer to like 45% or 50%. The second part of it, carbon neutrality by 2050, is on target with the keeping climate global warming at 1.5 degrees. So we've kind of got a blended goal here. The first part is it all meets IPCC recommendations. The first part is it's in the gate, but just barely. The second part is dead on. Now, as I say, that's we can define as a group what we ultimately want. The important takeaway, though, is to know that as you look at the goals, if something feels overly aggressive, and we decide that it needs to be something different, if we reduce it, that's for this group to decide. It may affect what this chart looks like and what this end goal ultimately wants to be, and vice versa. If we look at a goal and we think, oh, I think it's possible for us to go beyond that. I think we want to do something else. If it's a higher number, then that also would find its way through this chart and potentially increase our goals. And I'm not trying to tell you that you have to do one or the other. I'm just saying that they relate to each other, and we can help create that linkage as you talk about it. So any questions at all? I'm going to stop sharing and just open up to see if there's any questions right off the bat here.
Yeah, my name is David Shankonecht. I've seen some of the maps that talk about development corridors for Kane County. For example, in the Fox River Valley, kind of the urban corridor, and they're basically thirds of the county running north and south. And then through the middle of the county, it's kind of the development corridor, which we know that is mostly agricultural right now, but there's still a lot of subdivisions pressing in that corridor. And then there's the kind of the rural corridor of our county. Is that a given as we work through this process, or is that something that can be contemplated as well?
That's a superb question, and I think my answer is that it could be either. From a purely climate planning perspective, I think it would, whatever we can do to concentrate development very carefully is highly beneficial. So the density of our developments, and that doesn't mean that everything has to be downtown Chicago. That's density, but that's not the only kind of density, right? There's other kinds of doing things intentionally. But anything that we can do to concentrate development in ways that support walkability, reduction of individual vehicle use, convenience and effectiveness of public transportation, those all will have direct impacts on our emissions. And the other thing about sort of careful development strategies that conserve our land, that say, hey, we're going to put hard things in, we're going to be careful about where we put hard things so that we can keep green, growy things somewhere else, creates opportunities for agriculture, retaining agriculture, which is an important consideration for us, as well as the biodiversity benefits and adaptation benefits that we get from our green spaces, our trees and our prairie grasses and so forth. So from a pure climate perspective, as growth happens, we want to be very careful about how can we guide that growth thoughtfully to create the best communities that give us good livable communities that support this change of thinking. And then, of course, development is an economic issue, it's a tax-based issue, so there's all sorts of ways that the county may end up, the communities within the county may end up looking at that. But from a pure climate perspective, whatever we can do to guide for appropriate density and preservation of green is good. I see a couple of hands. I don't know who raised first and so forth, but maybe Linda?
Yes, this is really exciting. I worked on some of these same issues for Weyerhaeuser back in the 70s before Reagan came in. And it's just really, really exciting to see these things finally getting into there. One of my questions is going to be, are you prioritizing basically with return on investment on some of these, or like I know the syngas, there was a company in Illinois that was working on producing syngas. And part of the problem was it was good if they got to, if the price of oil was above, I think 100 or I think $70 or $80 a barrel. And then when it would drop, it wouldn't work that well. And I'm just curious, how are you picking these, and what are what are the outlooks on it?
So that's a good question. And there's a kind of a twofold answer to it, or a two-step answer. The first step is that within our the actions that we have in our plan, this group will actually be able to participate in the prioritization. And the way we're going to do that is we will, in one of our next workshops, we will have an opportunity to look at, actually, I think coming out of this workshop, it's going to be a homework item. We will look at potential screening criteria for actions And then you guys can add more to it. We have like a list of, hey, here's 20 or 24 screening criteria that we've seen other communities use for assessing a prioritization of an action. This group can then talk about it and decide, what 3 screening criteria do you want to use, for instance. And that will be one way that we can filter actions for prioritization or refinement. So, if a community, if we end up saying that, well, screening criteria A is very important to us. Well, as we look at the actions, we can say, how good is this action likely to perform on criteria A? And we can give it a number, and we can also say, well, even more importantly, what can we do to this action to make it fit A better? So some of the prioritization will be based on the criteria that this team will establish. And then we'll review actions and give a sense of what we think about that. And then we'll also help prioritize actions in terms of potential GHG benefit. So that's one layer to answer your question. The second layer is when it comes to very specific technologies, for instance, like plasma gasification or synth gas. I anticipate we may, if that were to be included, it's probably going to come about in terms of hey, let's look at a pilot project, or hey, let's do an economic development study about the potential for, where the next step will be to explore specific technologies, if that's appropriate. So some actions will be a little bit more technology agnostic, or where we may get very specific about a technology. It's either one that we know is fully effective, it's got incentives, it's financeable, et cetera, like solar. Solar works, we know it, we don't need, we know that it works. It doesn't work for every property, but it's a deal that works for many properties. We know that we can advance that. So let's talk, we can put actions in there specific around that. Plasma gasification, for instance, is a technology that we know is effective technically. Whether or not it's financially appropriate for one community or another, it may be something that maybe wants to be studied. So if we had something in there around that as a technology, for instance, it would probably come out in the form that says, here's some next steps to advance how that might happen, if that makes sense. So that the prioritization will be a part of the next step. How can we, for those things that are really complex that need some very detailed engineering or study or additional input or consideration, then that's probably what our action is to do that. Let's do that next step.
Thank you.
And then I see Craig had his hand up, and then Perry after Craig.
Yeah, thank you. My question was regarding your final slide. Leading into our goal breakout, how do your overall percent reductions on that slide translate into our category reductions? So when we know that we're moving into, like I'm in the Building and Development Committee, you showed a 16% overall countywide GHG reduction from buildings. Does that translate to a 30 or 40% categorical reduction? What are we looking at accomplishing for each individual category as we break into that? Do you have that chart or those numbers that'll be shared?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to reshare my screen. So we have this chart, which shows, hey, if all of those goals existed, this is how we would achieve a 25% or more reduction by 2030. And this is the share. So much out of transportation, et cetera. By the way, in this particular chart, waste management shows up as a 0, but it's only because it's already it's a smaller share. And so a share of waste management, a partial reduction in waste management as a small share of a total already. So it is actually on the chart. I mean, it does add value. It just numerically it shows up that way, right? But anyways, there's this chart which shows how the preliminary goals relate to the overall reduction. And then for each section that has greenhouse gas emission reductions, like this one for buildings and energy, you can see these strategies. Not all of them have emission reduction. Some of them are resilience, for instance. But you see how each of these strategies then have a preliminary estimate for how they contribute to that sector's reduction. And these are all available in the baseline document, which is linked on the agenda also. Then I think, Perry, did you have a question?
I do. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering, like, take an example if we wanted to, come to some commercial buildings or even residential buildings and show that solar is viable. So where would is that something where we would do the research to determine the average, sun that would fall, and we should find those charts? Or do you have those charts that you would give to us that we can do this analysis so we can go to a commercial building and say, look, this is the lifetime of solar, this is the amount of sun that you get, this is typically the cost? I mean, you would have to justify everything, and you need a lot of data to convince anybody to do anything. Where are we getting that data from? And even if we did get the data, who oversees it to make sure we're accurate?
Yeah, so all of that, what you're talking about would be great potential implementation from the plan. So the intent of our plan here is to establish the actions that the county and or municipalities and or other entities within the county, we'll have to figure out kind of who's doing what, but actions that can be taken. So in the illustration that you've put out there, one action might be identify the top 20 solar potentials in community A and go convince them to put solar on their building. I mean, maybe we'd word it in a different way, but summarizing what I'm hearing, that could be an explicit action to do. An alternative action that might also support that would be, let's put together a group purchase campaign and promote that, and have installers provide specific return on investment proposals for participants, right? So that would be another way of doing that. So as a part of this effort here, we've provided the renewable energy potentials study. Just shows kind of high level, kind of ballparky what is possible countywide, thinking rooftop. And in there's charts that show in general what can we expect for kilowatt per square foot kind of a thing for our region, so you can get a sense of that. But I don't think it isn't this team's responsibility to necessarily convince property owner A that they should put solar on their building, but instead for this team to decide, is that an action that we want to see? We think we should put together a team of convincers that goes around and, solar concierge, that helps people understand the benefits of solar, how it can work for them, and the incentives that are available, right? That might be an action. So it's what this team wants to do is let's identify the actions that we think should be taken to help advance renewables at a detailed enough level that we can have a sense, that somebody can have a sense of like, oh, I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't need to be so detailed that we've worked out every nuance to it, because the implementers will, they'll be empowered to do that. Whoever's really the right person to guide that action, they can figure out like, all right, well, I think I need to put together like a brochure on solar, and so I'm gonna pull from this resource or that resource, or maybe that's not needed for this approach. Instead, I'm going to have contractors give explicit proposals. That kind of thing.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
And then I see Kevin and Alice, and I'm sorry, I'm seeing Sandy, Kevin, and Alice. And what I'd like to do is maybe we get through those three, and then we'll transition into our next step. Not to kill conversation, but just so we can move into the next conversation, we can always answer more questions. So, Sandy?
Hi, I've got two concerns or questions, concerns, whatever. It seems like agriculture is pretty low in the percentage that you can save with on the emissions group. And I have done some reading with Drawdown and other things, and it seems like agriculture, if you look at it from a little different viewpoint, how big do you make it could mean a greater percent. But instead of arguing with those, I'd like to propose that, or wonder if we're only going to do 25% now, shoot for 25% now, and then we got to do 50% in the next 20 years, wouldn't it be better to try to shoot for 30 or 35% now and the rest later? Because, you know, if we can't do it, the scientists are saying, you know, they're conservative to start with, and they're saying everything's going faster than what we thought. So we shouldn't try to do less now by any means than what I think, in my opinion, than what's being proposed. And I know you can only do so much.
Yeah.
But it seems like if we shoot for more, we might end up with our 25% at least. Just a thought. Anyway.
Yeah. So those are good points. And I'll just to kind of share back on both of those. On the agriculture component, so I will say, I did not mention this, but the agriculture portion is estimated using data and a tool that the federal government makes available for emissions calculations for agriculture. And what it is based on is the emissions impacts of the of what we put on the land, what we put in the animals, and what the animals put into the air. So it's things that are direct emissions associated with agriculture. It does not include fuel consumption for like trucks and such that are associated with agriculture. It does not include the building emissions associated with agriculture. Those are already captured in the respective sections of buildings and transportation. So that's one thing to consider. It also does not reflect the emissions associated with an interconnected global food system. So in other words, you know, the food that I buy maybe comes from wherever, and it's being shipped, and it's got cooling and all that sort of stuff. So it's specific to what's happening in the boundaries of Kane County that we can capture and understand. So when we look at things like drawdown, which is a great resource, or other resources, the numbers that they may represent are from a different perspective often, that are, you know, they're cutting through different swaths. And I'm not saying that's bad. It's just, you know, if you're going to say, well, what impacts does agriculture have? And well, you should definitely include building energy, because that's a part of it. But in our instance, it's already accounted for, because that's, you know, it's in another section, right? Okay. So that's one thing to just keep in mind. The other aspect is that, so I would definitely not speak against this team making the goals your own. That's what we're going to be moving into in the conversation. The importance that I want to just make sure the team's aware of is, as you think about goals, if for instance a goal says, hey, you know, increase energy efficiency by X%, let's just say 10%. We're gonna make our buildings 10% more energy efficient by 2030. What you can think about is that means 10% of your buildings will no longer consume energy, or every building in the county becomes 10% more energy efficient, or 50% of our buildings become 20% more efficient. You want to see what I'm saying? So, and those numbers, you know, I don't expect you guys don't have to do the math, but we wanted to give you enough info so you can kind of think about that as you start sort of discussing goals. As the numbers go up or down, it relates to, you know, what does that mean? What do we have to accomplish? And so the importance of that is twofold. One, we want to help you kind of feel out where you think the threshold is between very doable and challenging. And I would never recommend against the challenging goal. Challenging goals are lovely, because if we challenge ourselves and we miss it, at least we get more than we would have if we shoot low, right? So that's a good thing. But just understanding the order of magnitude of the challenge associated with the goal is important, because it can help us decide where do we, you know, what are we going to need to do to get that? You know, we have to, you know, so that's the kind of realm that I would suggest you think about as you talk about goals, is just kind of thinking about it from the perspective of both vision and knowing where it is a challenge. Not to say that you can choose a challenging goal, just be aware that it's a challenging goal, so that we can all think about that. You know, like, how are we going to make that challenging goal happen when we start thinking about detailed actions, right?
And
so
maybe if it's a little easier but doable, maybe we'll gain more momentum for the next round, you know, if it's doable.
Exactly. And the other thing I'll point out is, and again, I'm not talking again, I definitely do not want to dissuade the team. The team can decide that these goals are for you to make, right? So I don't have a horse in the race. I will, if you guys came back and said you wanted the goal to be like a tenth of what it is, I might prod back. Just like, are you sure? Because we're not going to, we're off the science here. So my role is to help facilitate, to help give input, and flag if just to make sure the team understands what we're talking about here.
Thank you.
But oh shoot, and then my brain just evaporated. But I think that's probably enough. The point is, it's goals for you guys to create. Okay, Kevin.
Hi, thanks. This is, I guess, maybe related to the topic you had. You almost touched on there. So I guess, are you providing, like, the baseline plan proposal here is based on Kane County? Is it assuming that all other counties and municipalities are kind of marching on the same path, or is it assuming that maybe not everybody is going to do the same amount? Like, I'm trying to understand, do we need to take that into account somehow? Because it's not just a local problem.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And in terms of outside of the boundary of Kane County, this plan is agnostic or mute. In other words, we're not necessarily assuming, nor would we necessarily have actions in the plan that might leverage beyond our county. Although that's actually not entirely true. Oftentimes we may end up with an action in there that says, hey, let's link up with other like-minded counties or other like-minded municipalities to further action at the state and federal and international level, right? That can be an action. So we can do things that help ripple beyond the county boundary. But as a county plan, we're looking at what can the county do and what can those of us that are in the county do, and how can we organize action here in our backyard and in our neighbor's yard, so to speak. But in terms of the effects that we have on global climate change and how global changes have effects on us, those are clearly interlinked. So if the rest of the world did not change at all, and Kane County was successful in eliminating 100% of its emissions, we would still be in the hurt bag, right? If the rest of the world continued to emit, does not make changes, we cannot bend the global curve all by our lonesome. But of course we can't, this plan can't, aside from saying, hey, let's link arms with others, what can we do to share information or partner with others? This plan's really about what can we do, and focus it that way. If that makes sense.
Got it. Thank you.
You bet. And then Alice?
How do we know, this really relates to what you just said about it, this being a global concern. How do we know if solutions that we are proposing are just going to kick the can down the road to be somebody else's problem? Like, if you are proposing all electric vehicles, lithium mining, or any of the environmental side effects that come from the factories of electric vehicles, you know what I mean? How do we know if what we're proposing is actually going to have a net gain, not just here, but in its whole process?
Yeah, and when I hear that, I think of it in terms, when you talk about net gain, I interpret that very broadly, which can mean both in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also broad sustainability considerations, consumption of materials and such. Am I kind of getting your drift properly?
Yes.
Okay, so I have then a satisfying and a dissatisfying answer to that. My dissatisfying answer to that is that how do we know we don't? And that's not a rule. What I mean by that is that there are some aspects of where we think we need to go as a world that are pretty ironed out, and we really know a lot about them. Other things, we have a good understanding that it's in the right direction, but we see that there's challenges associated with it. So you point out a good one, that the idea of electrification and the storage needs that come along with that, both at a utility scale, a home scale, business scale, our cars, etc. There's clearly environmental impact. I will say that from an overall climate, from a GHG emissions perspective, we still know that those are the right direction. Now, whether hydrogen's a better option than electric, we will continue to explore as a world, and that those technologies will evolve accordingly. But we do know that both of them are going to be advancements in terms of an emissions perspective. From an overall sustainability perspective, I mean, lithium mining's got some challenges to it. I will point out, though, that I just last week, I think it was, Toyota issued a statement that they believe that they have figured out how to do energy storage in their EVs that will produce a charge time of about 15 minutes. So now putting it on parity of charging a car in the same amount of time that it takes you to fuel up your car with gas and get a donut. They think they're going to get there with electricity in the next 4 years, which is incredible. I hope they can do it. The other thing that their approach takes, and many battery manufacturers and designers and scientists are exploring how to improve the recyclability of these systems. Lithium is a recyclable material. It's just that the way that the batteries have been constructed to date are not very useful for recycling. You can recycle them, they're just not properly, they're not as beneficial as they can be. And so while a lot of this stuff is still emerging, so it's got some challenges associated with it when we think really big picture, like you're pointing out, which is the right thing. We need to think big picture. But there's a lot of folks that are working on different aspects of that, because there's a lot of us motivated, right? There's a lot of us that see that our world can be better. Let's go make that happen. So that's there's positive to that, but the distasteful answer is that, well, we don't know the answers to some of that yet, but I do know that there's a lot of people working on it. And I do know that there are solutions in there. We just need to continue to bake that into our thinking. How do we continue to evolve what we're doing to evolve with the options and opportunities, Okay, Mavis, and then we can maybe move into the next step here.
In answer to that last question, I think we know that recycling solar panels will be a huge challenge. Recycling lithium batteries will be a huge challenge. Making sure that the people mining lithium are not slave labor is a huge challenge. And I, in my heart, believe that we are stopping all these coal plants from emitting terrible coal into the atmosphere, terrible carbon. We are stopping coal plants from producing coal ash. I think we can have faith and hope that we are not doing things perfectly, but we're doing them a lot better. So
yeah, and I love, and this dialogue is exactly the right dialogue. And I think what we'll find is the team has lots of different perspectives. And so the opportunity in this dialogue is, hey, this is a great point. Lithium's got some hair on it. Okay, let's recognize that. Hey, is this an opportunity? Could Kane County put an incubator together or collaborate with others to make a challenge? Hey, we want to support the new businesses that figure out how to cleanly recycle, reuse, and create a fully enclosed circular loop of battery storage or energy storage or lithium, right? I mean, we could make an action like that.
We could make some money.
Exactly, and make jobs and make opportunities for our communities, right? And some of it maybe ends up on the dreamy scale. That's okay. I mean, dreaming is a part of what we're doing here. Some things are going to be things we can do tomorrow. Some things are going to be actions that we know we can do, and it's just going to take us a little time to get it done. Some actions might be dreamy, and that's okay. I mean, that's what this full decades-long process is about. It's continue to dream of a better world and go take steps towards it, and not be afraid to point out when we know that there's a challenge with something. Okay, awesome. Let's now think about that. How can we make it better? So great conversation. Okay, so I'm going to move into the next step on the agenda here. I'm just going to actually, why don't we go ahead and take a bio break? Let's do 5 minutes, and then we're going to do breakouts, 2 rounds of breakouts. So let's take a 5-minute break. I have 12:30, so that's at 12:35. Be back in the video room here, and we'll talk about the breakouts. Okay.
Hi, Mavis.
Hi,
How are you?
good. How are you?
Good. This is going to be exciting.
It is exciting. Yes, it is going to be exciting, and it certainly is. And such a great group we have today. I'm so impressed by everybody being here and the expertise we have and the passion and the
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Everybody brings their perspective to their to things like this, and it really helps for creativity, because then you can hear what other people say and say, oh, I could use that idea too, or work with it.
Right. I think we're coming close to the hard part.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road. You got to have the ideas.